Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining and welcome back to the last but not least session of today. We will be talking about is a PhD worth it, which I think is a rather controversial conversation, really interesting. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. If you could keep your mics on mute, that would be great. Cameras, feel free to keep them on. That's fine with me. Any questions that you may have, do put them in the chat box. Tony, as the chair, can pick them up as he goes or leave them till the end. We'll see how the conversation flows. And just a reminder that the session is recorded, so it will be available on the app shortly after our session and YouTube channel to watch back. And closed captions are enabled should you need them. Now I'm going to hand you over to Tony, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thanks, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the session. Thanks particularly to the array of panelists I have in front of me on my screen, because I'm going to be picking their brains through this topic and see where we get to. From my own perspective, I did my PhD what seems like a long time ago now, and it seems that way because it was a long time ago. But I still have memories of it. And I think the question of whether it was worth it, I think everybody, I did a small poll on LinkedIn a couple of weeks back where around 50% were overwhelmingly, yes, it was worth it. A bit less thought it was worth it because it helped their career. There was about 12% that said it was worth it, but I didn't need it for my career. Then there was, in the minority, was no, it wasn't worth it at all. So there was quite a spread out there of our network. So maybe over the course of the next 59 minutes or so, we'll dig into that a little bit further. But I guess maybe I'd like to kick off and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and that will give the audience a context of what's shaping their opinion. And as you do that, perhaps also share a little bit about, obviously, your background and how you got to here and where you fitted that study pathway, but also what does the PhD mean to you? And therefore, how would you sell it or not sell it to someone else? But we'll start with Renos.
Thanks, Tony. And I remembered to unmute my mic this time, so that's a good start. Don't need a PhD for that, by the way, but it helps if you forget to have a PhD, because that seems to be a trend. My place on this panel is because I do have a PhD. In Tony's recent poll, I was in the 20-something% bracket of, I thought the PhD enabled my career. I'm not sitting on the fence at all today. So why do I think the PhD enabled my career? Well, first of all, I started off down the academic pathway. And when I updated my LinkedIn last year, when I finally left academia, it told me I'd been there for 26 years, 7 months. So I had a good go at that. I don't know exactly when I went down the blind alley, but it was a long time ago. And I'm now at Discovery Park as the head of innovation. And what does that mean? It means that I like to help people who typically come from PhD backgrounds, but are trying to do more translational and commercial research. And I can help them because I myself have some commercial research. That happened because my PhD was what's called an industrial case PhD. And when I turned up for the first time at what was then Wellcome Labs, you'll have to dig deep into prehistory to find out that that became GSK eventually by various circuitous paths. I was on the bench taking instructions for how to find laboratory stocks and do things from somebody who was involved with launching Zavirax long before it was commercially available over the counter for cold sores. It was a project to develop a drug called acyclovir. So that got me very interested in translational research from the very beginning of my PhD. I went through as a postdoc and then as a junior research fellow. And as I was planning my exit from academia due to nothing much happening during my fellowship, I invented technology. I went along to a tech transfer office and spoke to one Tony Jones about whether or not this was patentable. Tony, you spoke to some lawyers that you knew in your job, and they said, yes, it was. What did I want to do with it? So I and my co-founders of what became the company DomainX said we'd like to sell the patent. After everybody had finished laughing at us, we were told the only value in this patent was if we put it inside a company and generated some value around it. That became DomainX. After incubating DomainX for a few years in an academic lab and spinning it out, I was asked by the then dean of Birkbeck College, can you teach people to do this? And so for around about 9 years, I helped various postgrads, masters and PhDs to look at doing that. And that's how I've ended up at Discovery Park doing a similar role. So PhD did help my career. Was it worth it? Let's talk about it today.
Thanks, Renos. And first we'll come across to Jane.
Hi, thanks, Tony. I am always in research and I really enjoy being in research. So when I started in Cambridge as a research assistant, I wanted to do a PhD because everybody had PhD where I worked. So I just feel very odd I didn't have a PhD. I think it took me a lot of effort also to do PhD because I actually wanted to stay in here, but that time I cannot because there is no grant for a foreign student, a non-EU student. So I opt out to do my PhD actually in Germany. And that is how much I wanted to do a PhD. So for me, it was all worth it because it led me afterwards to do another postdoc research, which has led to my current job, which again is a research related job. So right now I'm working for a company called Therapeutics. So we are developing in vivo platforms for drug discovery for biologics. So I would say without all of my previous trainings, I will never ever land it in my current job. But on the other hand, so I didn't regret my own PhD, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary though. I think experience is more important.
Thank you. If we come down to Freya.
Thank you. I am currently working as a field application scientist for BMG Labtech, which is a specialist microplate reader company. So the bulk of that role is supporting scientists in sort of all different areas, academia, industry, pharma, with training on their microplate readers and also troubleshooting as well. So a very varied role, get to see a lot of different science, but without, I guess, the personal investment of doing that sort of research yourself. Before that, I was doing a PhD, so I finished about 1.5 years ago, so it's quite fresh still. And I sort of came to that. I finished a degree in biotechnology with enterprise, which was very varied, covered a lot of different areas of science, a little bit of business as well, and wasn't 100% sure where I was going to go next. I came across a project which just really sort of sparked my interest, so I thought, we'll give it a go, apply for that. And it is sort of what I ended up doing. I think quite early on in that, I decided academia long-term was not going to be for me, but sort of part of my PhD program, it facilitated a lot of extra training and opportunities. So I was able to do a 3-month internship at a company called Cam Bioscience, who were doing courses for life scientists, which had moved online for COVID at that time. So creating content for their online courses and a bit of sales and marketing. I also got to be involved in the Biotech Yes Enterprise competition with some other members of my PhD program. Various other training and sort of setting up events, running events. So quite a broad range of experience. I think making some notes and preparing for this, everything I've been doing is sort of very varied roles, and I sort of kept that up within the PhD. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. And Ricky?
Hey everyone, I'm Ricky Martin. I'm the founder of HRS, Hyper Recruitment Solutions. So we're a talent partner to the sciences. I don't have a PhD. I have a undergraduate honours from Cardiff in biochemistry. Very proud of going to Cardiff. I'm also a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, but post my undergrad, I've now spent the best part of 20 years serving and supporting talent. So for me, the PhD wasn't right because I probably wasn't that academic. I wound up people in the laboratories when I was growing my E. coli because I couldn't shut up. So finding myself in a role where I could talk to other scientists about applying science seemed a very logical option for me, and a PhD wasn't required for that. So this is where I am. I've been running this business for 12 years, 50 of us helping talent across kind of UK, Europe and the US. So that I'll be trying to give an opinion. I can give an opinion on both sides of the fence. I won't sit on it, but I can definitely give you positives for a PhD, less positives, but I will say it's horses for courses. So look forward to kind of sharing and discussing more.
Excellent. And last but by no means least, Anji.
Hi, I'm Anji Miller and I work for LifeArc. So essentially what I do is I ensure that great academic research gets to the patient. So along that innovation pathway, the skills required, it's a combination of science, business and law. My background is advanced therapy. So my PhD is in cancer gene therapy. I have several degrees before that, and they're all in the sciences. I knew I wanted to be a scientist. So that was my path. It was really where I just wanted to know more and equip myself and upskill myself more so I could be a scientist in the lab. However, it wasn't that I didn't enjoy being in the lab and I didn't enjoy actually being at the bench and having my own project. I just didn't enjoy the career path that was ahead of me. So, you know, the academic or industry, it was just really being in the labs all the time. I wasn't going to have the academic freedom I had as a PhD or early postdoc. I was going to be training others to do the sexy stuff that I want to do, but also I would be chasing, you know, publications and applying for grants. Also, my personality, I'm a people person. So, you know, a basement lab with no windows, it's really not the place for me, really, because I'm going to try and escape eventually. I found a way to use my PhD out of the lab. So a lot of what I do also at LifeArc now is training and guiding others to do the same. Was it worth it for me? Yes, because I pivoted at a certain stage. So, you know, I went for what I needed, but I needed more at that, you know, and it was that I moved on, but I use these skills. And certainly my PhD has opened doors and avenues that would not be open to me. I still use my expertise. So I do a lot in the advanced therapy space. And the skills that I learned during my PhD, I use in my career as it is now.
I guess maybe that's an interesting point to pick up if I could continue on that theme with you, Anji, for a moment.
Yeah.
You referred to skills you sort of developed in your PhD, which you've used through. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What you thought the sort of transferable or additive skills?
Yeah, there are some by nature of studying a PhD in that depth that you have and you use as a scientist. So, you know, if you have a look at the list of skills, people would say critical thinking. You learn to analyze things, you learn to problem solve and find a way to solve the solution. You dig deep. So the research aspect, the fact that you can really do that diligence within the science to find out what are the issues, the questions, you'll question things. Collaboration, working with others, for sure. I'd say also there is a particular writing skill, and it's tarnished my writing skill now because I still write as a scientist very long sentences that don't need to be that way. But you do learn to actually, you know, for an article, it works doing that. I think there are many skills that you use in the lab, you know, multitasking and timekeeping for sure. But there are skills that you use in the lab that when you are working out of the lab, you need to enhance them a bit more or tweak them because they're not quite the same. So presentation skills. How I would present science is not the same as how I would present, for example, any like a business plan or any sort of proposal. So you do need to learn to tweak. The networking skills are completely different as well. It is where, you know, it's you're not going to stay there showing off about your research when you're presenting and talking to someone and you're networking. It really is where you find common ground and you take it from there. So it's a very different approach. But I do feel that it did provide a good starting point, certainly for what I do now.
And James, when you touched upon the way you felt you wouldn't have landed the role you've got now unless you'd done a PhD. So, I mean, do you feel your PhD has remained more relevant because you've gone in research as opposed to move away?
Not really, because well, the topic of what I did in my PhD is on neurodegeneration and RNA binding protein. And right now I'm working with monoclonal antibodies and in vivo platforms. It may seem to be very, very different. However, for my postdoc, I did work on human B cells and lymphomas. It all paved the way to where I am now. So it's not very far away from what I was doing. However, I would just like to add to Anji's point, like, since I am still doing research, I think there is a difference of how much you can learn skill-wise in PhD. Because when you are in a company setting, the technical skills is what I mean particularly, without all of the other soft skills. Technically wise, I think as a PhD, you have all of the freedom you can. You have all of the expertise around you for you to acquire any technique you want. This is one thing I appreciate the most. I could one day want to learn more on flow cytometry, and then I find someone doing it and follow them. And the other day I want to learn about I don't know, brain structures, and then I go find a friend somewhere else and try to know how to do dissections of the brains and stainings and everything. So that was a part I really liked, like so much of diverse technique I can use. But there are other skills I think I should have acquired more while I was doing my PhD, which are the soft skills that Anji has mentioned, that I think you could, if you ever decided to want to do a PhD, there's other things you probably want to also acquire while doing your PhD to make your career choice more, wider, let's say.
Okay. And I guess, Ricky, that kind of leads me to asking you really in terms of when you, I mean, you've placed, I don't know, probably hundreds of people, if not thousands by now. But therefore you've assessed them as the recruiter and where do they fit. Do you see a sort of a characteristic of those who have done a PhD as opposed to not? When they
ultimately, it comes down to the role that somebody's looking to go into, where their interests lie. Because if a role is non-research orientated, which is kind of, I don't know, scaling up a great innovative product, but it's already in the license, it's commercial, and we're just making more of it. You don't necessarily need your PhD brain at that point. You don't necessarily need the extra research, ideas, creativity. You actually need to funnel that into a process and a structure and the execution of what you're doing. So ultimately, it comes down to what kind of gets people excited and interested. If it is research and taking the time to assess, and like Jane said, almost go down different rabbit holes based upon your interest, then a PhD could be a really interesting place for you to kind of develop and explore that. But if you're actually someone who wants maybe a bit more certainty, and the life of a PhD can be quite risky as well, because you have postdoc after postdoc before you move to the commercial world. And that is ultimately a 3-year kind of cycle, right? You don't know what it will be in the next 3 years. And the further you go down that rabbit hole, sometimes the more entrenched you become in that hole, that it's harder to then jump into the next one. So do I see characteristics? I think a PhD person is always inquisitive. If you're very, very inquisitive and you're curious, which is a trait that the commercial world does like as well, then I think that's what leads towards people going to PhD. They want to know something deeper and know at a more meaningful level scientifically, or try and break it or make it in other ways. Whereas it's not saying you can't be curious and you don't have to do a PhD. Someone like myself, I was more of I'd call myself an applied science rather than a science. I like to do rather than necessarily, not think, that'd be wrong, but I like to do and apply. And I almost like to race there before I even think about it at the front end. So for me, going into more of a commercial world made more sense. It's where I felt more comfortable. It's where I felt freer. So it really comes down to characteristic types, yes. High levels of curiosity do lead well into PhDs. High levels of commitment have to lead into PhDs as well, because you might not always be able to finish it, but the determination to want to finish something, to use that funded grant project to get an outcome, which maybe then has a commercial application, is a possibility. So characteristics can lean you that way, but it's not definitive. I think it's what really interests you. And sometimes if I was going back in time to my undergraduates, not only was I not a good enough scientist to really be a PhD, but I would go back and think, let me speak to some people who are academics, let me speak to PhDs that have moved into industry, and let me speak to non-PhDs that are in industry, and try and get a slightly balanced view of 3 different people's opinions and career paths. Because look, not every PhD needs to do academic. They can apply that at a higher level. So I haven't fully answered your question, Tony, but I don't think one characteristic says that you should do one or the other. I think sometimes it's when you wake up in the morning and what excites you the most, that's the pathway you should be following.
Yeah, and I guess that's something I think you've plugged into something we hear a lot in lots of different roles, I guess, is, you know, anybody's career, find what really energizes you and what you're interested in and your passion, whether that's starting companies, whether it's designing cars, or whether it's doing a bioscience PhD, or starting a business and being entrepreneurial and growing that from a different perspective.
And Tony, if I'm honest, we don't always every single day know what's going to excite us the next day, right? It's been opposite. Sometimes in that PhD, you can focus in an area and realize that maybe that's not for you, and you can move that to another area of research. I think actually the bravery of saying this isn't for me and I'll try something different, I still don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow morning, let alone like, yeah, I'm now running a business and we work with loads of customers, right? I still don't know tomorrow morning how that will be. So being opportunist, I think, is very valuable to every one of us, no matter what we choose. And the PhD can open opportunities. But if you get so deep in an area, sometimes it can close opportunities. So it's just trying to have a balance.
It is balancing that expertise in one particular area and say, does that make it harder for you to move? Or there's just less opportunities with that particular expertise? But I guess coming back to I'll come back to you, Freya, in terms of when you chose to do a PhD, how did you go about deciding whether it was a good PhD position to go for?
Yes, so first of all, it was something that sort of really sparked my interest. It was looking at nuclear receptor signaling in cancer. So that's something that I kind of had picked up on during my undergrad as something that I enjoyed, I wanted to kind of know more about. I think in terms of actually picking a PhD, they're going to be good. Everyone always says, you know, do you get on with the supervisor? Do you like the supervisor? So meeting supervisors, speaking to them. And I think as well, going beyond that, which is maybe not necessarily what I did in so much detail, is not so much do you like your supervisor, are they a nice person, but sort of do you have complementary working styles, the rest of the team, the sort of support around it. Do you want someone that's going to really sort of manage you quite closely, or do you want someone that's going to leave you to kind of get on with your own work and sort of drive it yourself? So sort of those kind of questions of what you want your PhD to be like. It's quite a flexible, you know, you can work how you want to work to some extent. So having someone that kind of complements and supports you in that. The other thing as well, my PhD was part of a program called Discovery Medicine North. So that ran across 4 different universities. So we had like a cohort of us starting working in all different areas, but we had regular training, networking, things together, and also funding available to us to do extra training beyond just the lab work. I think obviously a PhD experience is very unique. Every person has a different experience. If you're just in the lab, you know, and you just write a thesis, that might be great if you want to go on and do academia, but also just looking for, does it have extra opportunities for you to explore other areas and kind of try out different things to work out, even within academia or beyond, where is it I want to take this next?
And Renos, I mean, as well from your own experience, but you, over those, what was it, 26 years you were at Berkeley, you know, you've advised so many students coming through, or they've come to you for advice and help guide their thinking. How did you go about, you know, what were the top tips you gave them when they said, well, should I go for a PhD and what should I look for the right one?
Well, I'm relieved to say that the advice evolved over time. And I think that if I had to say one thing to the people on the call today and anybody watching this recording, is keep on reviewing your career, your goals, your skills gaps that you'd like to address, and don't ever go around thinking, I wish I could do that job, but I just can't. Because if you really want to, that really is the basis of why most people enter into a PhD. I don't know that it's always the exact same motivation of, you know, one day I'm going to help rid the world of disease X or Y or whatever it might be to an individual. But certainly I would say if there's one thing looking over years and years of knowing different people doing PhDs, is that you develop an appreciation for risk. So as Ricky said, PhD is risky business. I would go further than that and say a postdoc is risky business. A research fellowship is risky business, all the way down the academic track almost. But as well in industry, it's also risky because we certainly are in an era where cash flows are very challenged at the moment. Investor pipelines are very tight and people are losing their jobs en masse. It's hard to get jobs, it's hard to get funding for your enterprise. Risk is not something that is just the same all the time. And I think if a PhD does something for you, it tells you that, you know, when there's a full moon, your experiment may or may not work. And when there's a new moon, your experiment may or may not work. And people, you know, in labs sometimes have their sort of favorite times of day to do certain experiments because they could swear that there's something going on somewhere, the electricity supply, the water bath, whatever, is more forgiving to that experiment. All I'm saying is, if I was to advise anyone, it's just like the clock goes round and round, so does your career appetites, your career tastes, the sort of societal risk profile for certain types of job. So I would say if I advise anybody these days, is to take a look at the bigger picture. Is this right for you right now? Are you ready to step up into potentially new skill sets or working with new types of people? So as Jane was saying earlier, you know, she wishes she had different opportunities during a PhD, and then we heard from Freya that there were tons of opportunities during a PhD, and that in itself can shape how you go forward. Certainly, I said at the start when I described myself, what I did shaped what I did. And so I would throw it back to people and say, just keep on reviewing what you want and be ready to not only upskill yourself, but maybe to start interacting with people who have complementary skills. Scientists are brilliant scientists. Business people are brilliant business people. Can you get together and find that complementary working style that Freya was talking about across what is seen as a divide of you know, skill sets? So that for me is it. Keep on reviewing and keep on accepting that everything has a risk, and day and night and so on.
I'd just like to pick up on that risk assessment, if you like, or continual risk assessment. And I'll come to Anji and Ricky in a moment. If I start with the two who are still in research, having done a PhD, would you perceive leaving research in the lab as a risk, a big risk, because it's a step into the unknown or things you haven't done? Is that a barrier to continuing in or not a barrier, but a driver to stay in research rather than leave, is the risk of leaving an environment you're comfortable with. I'll come to Freya. Who do you first?
I guess I was sort of ready to move out of academic lab into a sort of more, now it is a more commercial role, but working quite closely with people still in the lab. The PhD program, again, had all those opportunities, and there was a big focus on what other career options are out there. So I know when I first started, someone said, well, why would you ever do a PhD if you don't want to be an academic? Whereas this sort of approached it with quite a different lens, I guess, of this is a great opportunity to gain skills. You can then take those into other areas. And because it was that sort of collaborative experience with other people, different cohorts, I saw a lot of people in the year above me or the year above that went into these sort of roles. So I think it was quite, for me, a natural step to move out of the sort of research environment.
And Jane?
Click on the wrong thing. I do need a PhD for that. I think for me, I love a challenge, and I did make sure I finished my project when I move on to the next step. So there was a full closure for me, and I enjoy the freedom of choice. So I don't like to make choice because I have to, but because I choose to. So when I choose to do my PhD, I choose to do my postdoc, and I choose to put a stop on it. So for me, there isn't any, like, I regret to do this and not regret to do that. So for me, I think people will be happier if you think in this way, that you will regret on not to do certain things in your life than doing it and not regretting it, not thinking about it. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm in line with your question.
No,
Could you just ask that again?
It's kind of you've articulated in perhaps a different way, in the sense of it was a real driver to do it rather than a fear of not doing it, if you know what I mean. It was,
Yes.
so I know, putting myself back when I chose to stop doing lab research and move into technology transfer, even though I'd accepted long before then that I was never going to be a Nobel Prize winning scientist.
Exactly.
It still felt like a big risk to me at the time, because it was a step in. I didn't know what these other careers did. I think society's got better and the system's got better at explaining what career options there are. But I mean, I'll come to you, Anji. Did you see it as a risky step to move out of research?
I don't see it as a risky step now, but when I did it 20 years ago, they thought I was crazy. I mean, absolutely crazy, because at that time I had a lot of research experience, and I fought so hard to get a PhD involving gene therapy. It was hard at the time. There were no fellowships. I had to find a lab, and then we applied for grants for me to complete my PhD. So, they knew the struggle that I went through to do that. And also the fact that it was where they were like, you're so experienced. By the time you finish your PhD, you're so experienced. It's really where we can see that you enjoy it. Why are you thinking about leaving? But the thing is, I just knew that I had it in me to be a Nobel scientist, but it really I wasn't going to stay in the lab. There was no, it wasn't the career path for me, because that buzz that I got from being completely autonomous, I would not have that later. And I could see around me, even the work I was doing after my PhD, it was just, but the reason why they thought I was crazy as well is because I went and did a master's after my PhD, and I had a master's before my PhD. So they were thinking, but it was in a completely different discipline, because yes, you're right, where it's a bit better with career options from the lab, but it's not good enough. Absolutely not. I speak to so many, and they said if I had known years ago, but also, why aren't we talking about a lot of these careers that really pivot from having a PhD or are related to that? We should do that from the undergrad level, because technology transfer, Who do you know says, when I grow up, I want to be a technology transfer professional? Yet still, how long have we been around? We've been around for yonks. But I think today, depending on the lab that you're in, I've spoken to researchers, and this is quite recent, where some have said, I cannot even talk about a career away from the bench, because it will negatively impact my progression. That should not exist. I mean, that should not be, but that's real. That's the reality of what individuals are going through when they're studying PhDs. And then you have other programs where they're very, they expose you to a lot of different things. You learn all these different skills. So I think when you say PhD, not every PhD is exactly the same, and the experience is not exactly the same, unfortunately.
And Ricky, you seem to sort of know, as you were saying up front, you didn't want to go on and do more studies and PhD. You chose that. I mean, how did that feel at that intercept where you'd done your science degree as the honours degree? At that point in time, I mean, obviously you're much younger than me, but it was almost expected from the year I was in that you were studying to go on and do a PhD if you were doing the biochemistry undergrad.
Look, I'll be honest, all my family were well disappointed when I said, so you're no longer going to be a dentist or go into kind of medicine? No, you're going to go and do recruitment. Well, are you joking me? That was kind of the rhetoric that I kind of felt. And our model is we normally hire a STEM graduate and apply them into recruitment so we can train. I think it's easier to help recruiters to build their careers if they have an intrinsic interest in the space rather than a recruiter trying to get to know a space. So I always have that conversation with any kind of STEM background. Do you really want to step away from science? What are your family going to think? What are they going to say? The reason I was prepared to do that, I didn't see it as a risk because I was growing E. coli for 12 hours a day, 5 days a week in the lab in my third year of uni. It sucked the science out of me, to be brutally honest. Like, I couldn't see. I didn't help that I also had bleached hair and a mohawk and I wrestled outside of it. So I didn't quite fit the mold as well. But science sucked out of me from that perspective. I was actually more disappointed that I'm not going to really apply it. But when I went into recruitment, I was very clear. I won't recruit for anything other than science because it's what I study. It's what I like to talk about. It's where my interests still sit. Anji said something a minute ago, which resonates well. And I says, no one should ever feel like they can't leave something and go back. I think that is wrong. Okay, might be hard to leave a particular role where there's only one person doing that role in the business and slot back into that. Okay, it's a granted fair point. But sometimes I think to leave research and come back, you can bring other skills with you, which are really exciting. And you can leave a commercial world, go into research and go back again and appreciate what's happening in discovery science a little bit better. Maybe you've seen it cross over with everybody's talking about how they're putting kind of the dry lab alongside the wet lab these days to look at the way we can kind of model things. How interesting is that to see how the kind of the statisticians, the informaticians can model things for the lab? So sometimes going away is good. And I was told something many years ago, and this is pre-setting up HRS. I did some work with P&G, and I always found it fascinating trying to get an idea at the top, because where the consumer good businesses are really good is focusing on behaviorals. And I was like, it's really interesting that your top tier people here actually started with you, left and come back. They said, it's not interesting at all, Ricky, it's design. They said, our model is you can never be that top exec in our environment if you've never seen the world outside of where we are right now. So it's a big risk, and you've got to be a global player to be able to execute that risk. But they wanted people to go elsewhere, see it in other ways, gain ideas and bring it back again. So to apply that into the world of research and PhD, absolutely you can go and do something else. But yes, fairness, the longer you're away from doing something, the rustier you do possibly become, and maybe the harder it is to go back. But it shouldn't be as linear as you've been out of it for 3 years, you can't come back, or you've left, there's no point of return. I do think that is quite wrong. And sometimes I think big businesses can institutionalize. You think there's nowhere better than, I'm not going to say a name in case they're a client and there might be someone online here, nowhere better than our place to do this. But it's a very old school track. And in fact, we all like a range of ideas. If you think of diversity, we're also thinking of the way we think and the way that we act and the way we interact. And actually, we don't want a bunch of robots and clones. We want varieties of opinions, a variety of thoughts. So I actually think going away is brave and can really help you long term and help business. But you also need the right group of people to accept the fact that actually that's how things that's how you can innovate.
That's part of the development process kind of thing. Yeah, I get that. And I just wanted to sort of touch upon, I guess, whether the panel feel attitudes and scenarios change. It's sort of, I think, Jane, you mentioned about, do employers value experience now as much as they value the qualification? And I kind of hear that a lot from some of the companies that we work with, in terms of we just need to find really good people. I don't really mind what their qualification is if they can show me they can do something or develop into it. So I'm going to probably come to you, Renos, I think, again, because of your now role with encouraging enterprise or innovators and new enterprises down at Discovery Park. Do you see a difference in the mix of people that come across your radar?
Yeah, I think it's down to those changes in PhD doctoral training programs. So again, going back to Jane and Freya's points, the amount of opportunity that's now available to doctoral training students, and it does differ by region. There are different emphasis in different doctoral training programs, but there's finally, and I say finally, it's been going on for a good decade or more, an acknowledgement that you need to come out of the PhD acknowledging the fact that only 1% of all PhD students will make it to professor. It really, that statistic has not changed since it was published by the Royal Society in 2011. So yes, well, by the time the end of your PhD comes, only 26% of you will go on to a postdoc. And if by the time of the end of that postdoc, only 11% of you who got a PhD will still be in research science, be that academia or industry, you've got to prepare for that eventuality. The other thing the doctoral training programs are engaging with a lot more is what kinds of industry careers are there? And this is where I've had my greatest enjoyment of interacting with people for many years now. Within every PhD cohort are 2 or 3 people a year who think, could I do my own venture? And really just the mere fact of exploring that with them, you come to realize anybody could, whether or not they have a PhD, if they've got the right team around them. And again, one of the big points I make to people is investors into risky ventures, particularly in life sciences, are really investing in the team rather than the idea per se. And that comes to Ricky's point, it's all about who are you? What experience do you bring? Where have you been? How are you looking at this? And we're moving away from these notions that can lead to groupthink. Everybody's got the same background, the same experience, the same set of opinions. And we're moving to something now where we're exploring collaborations between the business school and the natural sciences departments. And we're exploring very bright ideas coming out that could really be commercialized. But the person who brings them, and you may remember me from decades before, Tony, bright young man, just invented something, doesn't know a damn thing about business, get him a CEO immediately. And what we're trying to do is do that as not a formula, but as something that we do quite early, is we really need to protect your idea by giving it some momentum to keep going. It's just an idea right now. You need a team to take it to where it needs to go. So that's how I'd describe it. I hope I've answered the question there.
Yeah, I think getting back to one of the points you mentioned earlier on about when we met and you'd got your invention and I was in tech transfer and then suggesting to you might want to start a company. I think it was only a couple of days apart where one of your colleagues in a neighbouring office came to me and said, I want to start a company. As well, why? Well, everybody else has got one. They hadn't got an invention. It was just because everyone else has, which wasn't quite the answer I was looking for from a tech transfer office, to be honest. But Ricky, in your time now with HRS, I guess there's a fair few years of what you've noticed going on. Has there been a change in the employer attitude about what route someone has got to that position?
Honest answer is yes and no. Widely, I think more people are more open to experience, but it doesn't shock me time and time again. I hear some smaller businesses or contract services businesses trying to compete with the big players, and they're trying to say, well, I need to have a depth of academic qualifications, because I can say, I know, pick a completely irrelevant point. If anyone ever watches Suits as a TV series, they all hire from a certain university, is it Harvard or Yale or somewhere like that? They've got this, we'll only hire from them because we hire the best from the best to be the best. There are some startup organizations that have that mantra because they need to try and compete. 90% of our business went to Oxford or Cambridge, or 90% of our business have here. That still exists. Normally the smaller businesses, or sometimes the really tech businesses trying to sell some really decent kind of tech to big players, or service providers trying to say, well, you can give it to that company, or you can give it to us because of this percentage of academic mind. So there is still a pocket of that. I'm not going to say it's gone away. I think generally experience, and I have this conversation time and time again, and someone will turn around to me and say, Ricky, I want you to find me someone who, I don't know, I'm hiring for I've done a number of C-suite, CCO appointments recently to commercial people in the space. I ideally want someone to have a PhD in the area, they've networked with this industry in this region, they've had, I don't know, 10 to 15 years experience of working within the commercial space, of which 5 years have been leading the team. First and foremost, if people don't realize, you can't actually say the amount of years experience on job descriptions or requests. It's discriminatory. So it's actually against legal ethics to be able to put years of experience. But I would say 90% of clients I work with always put on there, I must have at least 5 years experience. It's the quality of the experience it comes down to. And I'll always stand by. You give me someone with 5 years at one place versus someone who's had 5 lots of 1 year experience, it's the same amount, but they're in their first year 5 times. This person's on life cycle year 6. So there is a difference. So the quality of the experience should always prevail. Easier said than done when you're starting your career, thinking, well, it shouldn't be my qualification, shouldn't be my experience, I should be able to compete. There's also a sense of reality sometimes, I think, that needs to set in for some people, of what experience do I actually have to offer. Actually, what you might be able to offer is being very moldable, very open, very flexible, not rigid. Sometimes it's harder to re-engineer someone than it is to get someone upskilled. So there are differences. But to answer the direct question you had, some businesses still have a bit of what I would call an old school mindset of, we need to fit this profile because this profile is what works for us, and they're unwilling to change from that. But I think if you genuinely are speaking to a hiring manager who's hiring some skills, technical, commercial, they'll take the personality and the individual's drive and commitment, and they might overlook some of those skills gaps or qualification gaps. And unfortunately, sometimes it's getting in front of the person who's actually hiring you is the complication there, because the bigger businesses have this whole process to get through before you get there, and the computer might say no on the way.
Yeah, it's you reminded me mentioning the CROs and the positioning and the competition. It wasn't long ago I sat in on a presentation of a fairly young CRO to one of the pharma companies, and he made a big play on one of their slides of, I think it was 83% of our staff have got PhDs. And the potential customer went, do they need PhDs to what they're doing, or am I just overpaying for you to employ a technician? And it was immediately cut down, like, that's not selling yourself to me. It's like, so I think there is this sort of perception though about what sells or what doesn't sell sometimes, I think. I mean, Anji, you do a lot with young entrepreneurs, a lot of the tech transfer to commercialization step. I mean, again, have you seen a difference? I mean, Renos touched upon now there's more education in the doctoral training programs about the commercial world and enterprise. Does that surface when you come across opportunities as a tech transfer office?
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons also why LifeArc, we run 2 fellowship programs for individuals with STEM backgrounds wanting to become technology transfer professionals. It's because they realize what they can do, but how do you get there? There are some really, really good programs though that really do open the eyes of the individuals within there. Not only are they they're learning whatever discipline they're taking, and it's usually a STEM background, but the thing is, they have the opportunity to experience different things. And it's great when you see that, because the thing is, it's a more filling experience. But also, if someone is staying in the lab, they know it's a conscious decision. It's not where they think that's the only route and that's the only option. I think, earlier on, we talked about the additional skills that you need to have. For any role, there are so many roles involved in working with academic research or translational research and really getting it further along the development pathway. It's really to say like, okay, you've got this PhD and you're going to be there in the lab, you're going to be at the bench, and that's all you're going to do, and you're just going to use these skills. Really, it's so short-sighted to do that. And I think really for UKL PLC, if we're going to be the superpower 2030, it's really where, if we're going to achieve those ambitions, we're really going to have to broaden the prospects, ensure that all these programs are enriched with these additional opportunities and exposure to many roles. I think it is not just the technical area, but the thing is making sure that it is a fulfilling and rewarding experience. Otherwise, people are not going to study STEM. You're not going to have the expertise there. And it's really where it's a shame to do that, because a lot of people, they enjoy what they do. And I think one other aspect that I think this whole sector needs to do, and it's a culture change, is if someone decides to use their expertise in a different way, it shouldn't be seen as failure. It's a choice that they're making. And I think too often, if you study, for example, microbiology and you don't become a microbiologist, everyone's like, what are you doing? What? You know, when you're thinking like, that's crazy. I mean, it's we know it's crazy, but the thing is, a lot of people are almost made to feel as though they failed. And that's not the case. They are using those skills, but in a different way. And I think we need to, I come across people third, fourth career. I mean, Tony, you were in TT. I'm more at the lab. It's like, well, so the thing is, you know, we shouldn't see it as failure. We should encourage these things, because what fulfilled you at this point in your career may be different later. And I think we should, or it's a lifetime of learning.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's always that part of the thing is you don't stop learning. As soon as you're in any workplace, or just life in general, you keep learning. I guess it's sort of, it got prompted by a question that's about top tips on your CV to pivot from research into a different role. I think, Renos, you sort of answered that one, but it's kind of made me think about.
I didn't answer it completely. I just thought if we ran out of time, that's a good stock answer, but I can come back to it after if you want.
Perhaps we'll delve into a bit more now, in a sense, because it does relate to sort of top tips on a CV. But I was going to ask maybe each of the panelists, if you looked at your CV now, what are you most proud of being on there? So maybe I'll start with Anji. You've got a long CV, so we're going to go with you.
Yeah, I do have a long CV. I think for me, it's not one particular thing. I would say it's how I've used everything along the journey, all those degrees, all the experience that I've had, that I've managed to roll them into and incorporate them into what I do today. So I think that would be, so it's not quite the top tip, but I think it's really where it was a journey. And I haven't reached the destination yet, because for me, I'm still expanding and exploring all the time. And I think that would be the thing that I'm most proudest of, that my mind is wide. It's not narrow. I'm open to opportunities and experiences.
Jane, what are you most proud of on your CV?
It's very tough to answer, and how to grab the attention of the employer. I think that's really difficult. When I wrote my CV, you do need to make sure that the skill set you put on that is corresponding to the job you are applying for. That's most important. That means at least you are not sending 100 of same CV to 100 different jobs. What I am most proud of, it's very difficult to say. I guess all my experience. I mean, otherwise, why do you do it? Why do you write it down? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Freya.
So I guess I am pretty early in my career still, but I guess I'm very proud that I've managed to take a lot of opportunities already from the experiences that I've had to sort of build up quite a wide range of different experience, and have been very lucky now to find a job that kind of encompasses a lot of that. So sort of the research side, being involved in science and that inquisitive nature kind of thing, but also in a role where I get to travel and meet loads of people and talk to people and present things. I really enjoy that. So yeah.
Renos.
I'm most proud of the fact that something I did over a quarter of a century ago is still highly relevant to an employer today. And coming back to Ricky's point, I completely agree that the legislation around the last of the great isms, ageism, is there for a reason. And it really, yeah, you could stretch the truth quite far to say that you're the right person for a job if you have barely any experience in it. So I do agree that it's about the experience. And I think for me, this is why something I did so long ago is still relevant today, because it's relevant experience. And so I've seen in my CV that I've pretty much been doing roughly the same thing in a number of different guises for a long period. And really what I've been doing is deepening my experience. And that's what I'm proud of.
And Ricky, I mean, you sit on your own CV, but on the other side of looking at many CVs, you know, what are you most proud of on yours? And then what sort of things stand out for you on the other side?
I think the way sometimes to look at it is what's going to have impact for you. So first and foremost, let's just assume that all the bullet points of duties and stuff, everyone else is writing them. So that's not the thing that we should be proud about or spend overly too much time on. I look at three things. I look at CV, I look at impact, I look at personality, and I look at interest. So if I looked at my CV, I would say what are the three things that I'm actually really proud of? I would say, as a business, we've raised over £100,000 for charity. Okay, it's not what my business does day to day. We're a commercial enterprise. We are working with clients. We have fees. But what I'm really proud of is my whole business has got behind me and worked with me to raise money for a variety of charities, which for me is impact. And particularly in a space like life sciences, I think impact is very important. If I were to follow my CV down, I'd put on there saying I'm a very, very proud father. And I'd follow that up with, I had 4 rounds of IVF to have my first child and years of heartbreak. So I share that openly as a man's journey with fertility, but also because you'll be surprised how many people go on these journeys, and it shows a commitment to something and actually is quite thought-provoking and can get conversation started. And then I'd put something on there about what am I interested outside, like something that I am actually interested in outside, like not the stock answer, something like professional wrestling, for example. I still like it. I still kind of ad hoc watch it, not that I can fit into my pants anymore. But sometimes if you're looking for something on your profile where some 3 things stand out, you want to have impact outside of it. And if I just give one last bit of tip there, when you're writing a CV, don't just list all the bullet points. Let's just say you normally put 6 things, put 4 things, and then put 2 achievements that have deliverables. So I have achieved this in this time period. I over-delivered on this within this time period. I executed this project within this time. Take those 6 bullet points, put them into 4 and 2. Same amount of space, impactful 2. This is what I did is the 4. This is what I did well at the 2. That's what can help in what is going to be a crowded market for talent.
I think that's really helpful advice, I think, for anybody listening. And it's been really helpful advice across the panel discussion, I think, for anyone either doing a PhD and thinking, where do I go from here, and not getting despondent about was it worth it or not, because it's a very personal journey, but actually seeing it as a personal journey and it's part of your development. And I think that's something that we should never lose sight of. PhD, any job, any career, I think you should always view it as a journey. I think you mentioned, Anji, and you're not at the end yet. You know,
Absolutely.
I think there
might be another PhD in there.
Well, who knows? You know, it'll be in AI and data science or something. But I think it's, you know, what's come out to me, I'm conscious we're just coming up to our time. So thank you for all you've shared. And I guess it's, for me, really reinforced or reassured me in a sense of my take on, is it worth it? Isn't a question that's just, there's only one answer to. Does it serve a purpose? There's not one answer to it. Depends where you want to end up. I've always been a believer in careers being to some degree opportunistic. No matter with the best planning, the right things have to come up to take them. But you can think about all these breadth of skills and transferable skills and how you approach things that actually mean that everything's possible until proven otherwise. So I just had to thank the panel for all of your insights. Thanks to the questions that came in. And I look forward to catching up with everyone soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank
and
you.
all the
Thanks for the
speakers.
kind comments, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.